the first question I have for you is, can you just take me back to September 11th, 2001, just through your eyes, what you remember seeing and hearing and experiencing that day?
That day is really etched in my memory, as it is in the memories of so many other Americans. I was at my little townhouse on Capitol Hill. At that time, I lived very close to the Capitol, and I had the Today Show on, and they were discussing that it appeared a commercial plane, a small commercial plane, had just hit one of the towers of the World Trade Center. And I thought, oh, that's awful, but then I left for work, and as soon as I got in the office, I turned on the television, and the second plane had just hit. And I knew then that this was no bizarre commercial accident, that it had to be a terrorist attack. So the first thing I did was send a message out to my staff telling them to stay away from the Capitol building and to go home. And within a few moments, the Capitol Police were knocking on our doors saying, evacuate the building. At the same time, I had staff who were coming back from a trip to Maine, and as they were flying over the Pentagon to land, this was before everything had been halted, they saw the smoke billowing from the Pentagon. They had to have been one of the last flights that was allowed to land that day. And it's chilling to think that they were likely in the airport at the same time the terrorists were. I walked home, and I remember so well that there were armed soldiers with powerful rifles, machine guns in front of the Supreme Court, which was on my route home. And I thought, this is really a horrific attack. And needless to say, I turned on my television and was glued to my set, worried about how many lives were lost that day, inspired and astounded by the courage of our first responders, seeing the firefighters going into the buildings as people were running out. The images were just unbelievable. I then later in the afternoon learned that our Senate leaders, as well as the president, had been whisked off, understandably, into hiding. But that bothered me because I felt the American people needed to see their leaders. I walked to the Capitol Police Station, and a lot of my colleagues had had the same thought. And we got updates from the Capitol Police and stayed there for a few hours. We then learned about what happened in Pennsylvania and how the passengers on that plane saved us from a third attack that day. Incredible courage, and lost their lives in doing so. And several of us felt that we should go over to the Capitol steps, and that was really important for America to see its government is still functioning, and we're still a strong country despite this devastating attack. And we did go on the Capitol steps, and someone started singing God Bless America. And I have to tell you, it was one of the most moving moments of my life. And all of us joined in, and we all started singing. And I swear everyone had tears in their eyes, and yet this wave of patriotism swept over us, and determination to protect our country from further attacks. And I remember looking out at the press corps and seeing reporters too wiping their eyes. It was an extraordinary moment. And this attack was so horrific. And it also brought out the best in people. People rescuing one another, giving their lives for others. Our firefighters, police, first responders going into such dangerous conditions. And all across America, a feeling of unity and patriotism was prevalent everywhere.
What did you think when you learned that 2 of the hijackers came right through your state?
I was stunned that 2 of the hijackers began their journey of death and destruction from Portland, Maine. Absolutely stunned by that. In addition, there was a rumor that proved not to be true that I'd heard from some law enforcement in Maine that others had come through Canada. And so there were a lot of rumors that were flying around, as there always is in a crisis like one as devastating as this.
Yeah.
But the idea that 2 of the hijackers began their journey through an airport that I'd been in and that so many of my friends and family members and co-workers had been in countless times was just incredible. I also had a hard time figuring out why. Why did they start their terrorist attack by leaving from Portland? Why did they drive up here rather than leaving from Boston? And we'll never know for sure.
What was it like? Because at the time that you were still a freshman senator then. So what was that like, navigating all of this information that's coming in and with your colleagues and just the pure horror of that day? What was that like?
The urge always is to call someone, to check on them, to talk to them about these awful events as they were unfolding. And the circuits were busy in Washington. You could not get a call in or out. I remember finally reaching my chief of staff, who told me that the 2 staffers we had traveling back that day were fine and safe and had made it back before all the planes were grounded. And I remember calling and trying to call family members and my colleagues, and that is why I left my townhouse and went down to the Capitol Police Station, because I figured that the information would be more accurate there. Most of all, in the midst of this horrible attack, I wanted Americans across the country to see that government still existed, that we weren't in the midst of a coup, that we weren't overthrown, and that we were resilient and strong, and we would make those who killed more than 3,000 Americans pay a price. I also continued to be overwhelmed and inspired by the sheer courage. Think how much courage it must take to run into a burning building when everyone else is fleeing and going the opposite direction. And I've always loved our first responders, but that day cemented it for me. I also wanted to do something about it legislatively, and I ended up having the opportunity to do that, to reorganize our intelligence community in a way that was more sweeping than any time since the end of World War II. I worked with Senator Joe Lieberman to accomplish that goal, and I will be doing an event with him on September 10th, the day before the 20th anniversary in New York, at the request of a family group that I got to know very well. And this group was united in support of our legislation to revamp and strengthen our intelligence community so that we wouldn't miss the signals and that we wouldn't be so siloed. And it'll be wonderful to see Mary Fetchett, who heads this group, once again in New York.
Absolutely. I want to go back to, because the unity on the staircase, that so powerful. Do you think that the unity that was felt that day could be felt in present day if something like that were to happen again, with just how divisive everything is right now?
Well, the polarization and the divisiveness that we see in our country today is the opposite of the feelings that we experienced on September 11th, 20 years ago. I still believe that confronted with a crisis, that Americans would pull together again. But it is certainly sad to see how divided we are, even within families today. The sense of patriotism and unity was so powerful, not just on the day we were attacked, but for a long period afterward.
Absolutely. I'm just going to check my notes really quick here. What are some lessons from that day that we should be remembering 20 years later?
One of the lessons is, regrettably, that the threat of terrorism still exists. I am very worried now that the Taliban has taken over Afghanistan, that it will once again become a safe haven for extremist groups like Al-Qaeda that would love nothing more, nothing better than to launch another terrorist attack. In the last 20 years, in part due to the reforms we implemented, we have been spared a major terrorist attack from a foreign entity. And that has caused some people to think that that threat has disappeared. It hasn't disappeared. The Taliban may not get along with ISIS-K, but they get along still with Al-Qaeda. And elements of Al-Qaeda still exist, and other elements of the Islamic State do not wish us well. And I am concerned that if they have a place to plan, they have a place to figure out how to launch another attack or to recruit those who will.
What can we do about that?
Well,
it's a broad question, I know.
it is.
It's a really broad question.
Where to begin? An important part is information sharing across the federal government and with our allies. We had lots of bits and pieces of evidence that we could be the subject of a terrorist attack prior to it occurring 20 years ago, but there was a failure to connect the dots, and there was a failure of imagination. And we can't allow that to happen again. So our intelligence community, which I'm also speaking to this week, needs to continue to work as a team, to not see agencies as rivals, but to pool their information and work as one. And second, we need to be realistic. None of us wanted to stay in Afghanistan forever, but the way that we left was a debacle. It was shameful. And I'm very worried not only for the Americans that were left behind, but also for our Afghan allies, for the interpreters, the guides, the drivers who helped keep American troops and diplomats safe. And I worry that we are going to inadvertently allow terrorist groups to once again have safe haven, and that the Taliban will go after those who helped us. I'm convinced of that, and we've seen it happening already. So that's a lesson that I don't think we learned very well, unfortunately. 20 years should not lull us into a sense of complacency. We still need a counterterrorism effort. We have a lot of threats facing us in the world today, and we're tending to focus on the great power competition with China and with Russia, but we shouldn't forget that we are still vulnerable to a terrorist attack because we are and want to be and should be an open society.
Check my notes one more time here.
There's just a third lesson that I'd like to add.
Of course.
If I can.
Yes, of course you can.
Third, we have to remember that when there's a terrorist attack, people dial 911, and they expect that they're going to get a response from our police, from our firefighters, from ambulance drivers, from EMT, and we need to make sure that they're respected and that they have the tools and the resources that they need.
Absolutely. I want to circle back to the creation of the Patriot Act. And if you think that we reacted properly and with some of the laws that were changed, do you think that, do you think we reacted properly with how everything was handled?
As is often the case when you have a horrific attack like this, there are some laws where we got it exactly right. I think we did a good job on our Intelligence Reform and Terrorist Prevention Act that Joe Lieberman and I wrote. On other areas, I think we went too far and did not have enough safeguards of civil liberties. One of the provisions that I'm proud of that Joe Lieberman and I included was a civil liberties board to look at the actions of federal agencies. We've seen that the Special Intelligence Court can be used very effectively, but it can also be abused. Mm-hmm. So I think there's always a balance, and sometimes we got it right, sometimes we haven't. That doesn't mean that you throw everything out. It means that you refine that where we went overboard.
Yeah. Is there any specific event, not to put you on the spot, but is there any specific event that sticks out to you that you really think, man, that right there we should have done differently? Is there anything that sticks out?
Well, there still is some dispute or confusion over what the FBI's role should be and versus the CIA. Mm. And it's an awkward partnership because the FBI can only focus on domestic terrorism, and the CIA's duty is never to be involved in the surveillance of an American, except as it happens where an American is overseas or an American is in direct contact with a foreign terrorist, in which case the FBI has to be brought in. But it gets very complicated very fast, because obviously you don't want to infringe on the civil liberties and privacy rights of American citizens. On the other hand, if an American is involved in a terrorist plot that has a nexus with overseas terrorist groups, then we've got to go after that individual. And I think we've forgotten a lot of the successes where terrorist plots against this country have been thwarted in the past 20 years. The New York subway plot is a good example of that, and there are others as well. But it is a balance that we have to reach, and sometimes we don't get it quite right.
We are human, after all.
Pardon me?
I said we are human, after all.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I wanted to ask about your pin that you're wearing. Can you tell me about the pin that you're wearing today?
This pin I've had for the last 20 years, and after 9/11, a group of senators, including me, traveled to New York City to meet with city officials and first responders, and that was the beginning of my relationship with some of the victims' families. And we were given this pin, which has the Twin Towers and then a flag over them, and of course the flag motif in the background. And I wear it virtually every 9/11, just to remind myself and remind others of what happened on that horrific day. I remember it was such a beautiful day outside, which added to the contrast of the utter horror that occurred. I also remember calling some of the family members in Maine and how incredibly painful those calls were.
Gosh, what got you through those days?
What got me through it was the realization of how lucky I was that I did not lose a personal friend or a family member or a first responder friend, and also a determination to figure out how did we not know that this was going to happen? Why weren't the dots connected? And what could I, as a senator, as a legislator, do to reform our laws in the hopes of greatly lessening the chances of this occurring again? And that was my determination. I became close to many of the family advocates who helped us with the bill, as well as with the leaders of the 9/11 Commission. Tom Kaine, the former governor of New Jersey, and Lee Hamilton, the former congressman from Indiana, who did a wonderful job in a totally nonpartisan way of looking at what exactly happened and what did we need to do. And one of their major recommendations was the creation of a director of national intelligence, and that's what our bill did.
Do you have anything else that you wanted to add that I did not ask about?
I was proud of America's response, of how we came together in the wake of the worst attack on American soil in our history. And I would hope that we could somehow rekindle that sense of unity that we all felt in the wake of 9/11. That would be perhaps the best tribute we could give those who lost their lives that horrific day.
What does, and this is the last question, I promise, every year when 9/11 rolls around, what does it bring up for you? What do you feel?
What I most remember is the firefighters going into the buildings and their incredible courage. I remember the death of the police chaplain and the death of the Mainers who were on those planes, as well as the military member in the Pentagon who had just moved into his new office, which was suspected to be the point of impact. And I also remember singing God Bless America on the Capitol steps. That was one of the most moving moments of my life.